everybody seeing the screen now and can see my cursor? Good. Okay, thank you. So the general title here, Why Are Leaves Green? New Frontiers in Solar Photovoltaics. I appreciate you all coming here to hear this little story that I'll tell you. And what I really want to start with is a bit of a conversation about energy consumption, worldwide energy consumption, where that energy comes from. And then moving towards solar photovoltaics, a little bit about interactions of light and molecules and how we can utilize that light, a bit about how solar photovoltaics work, and then sort of a new type of solar cell that is being investigated in many places, including our laboratories here at Furman University. And so, oh, that's right. That arrow there. Okay, so in terms of worldwide energy consumption, I've got a graph here in the upper left-hand corner. We've got amount of energy on the y-axis versus, you know, the year on the x-axis. And the first thing to notice, other than these being big numbers, is that oil still leads our energy consumption. Coal is the next most utilized source of energy, followed by gas. And then nuclear in the red line here and renewable in green are much smaller pieces of our overall energy portfolio, and that these are continuously increasing. The y-axis here is in consumption in terawatt hours per year. These big numbers never mean anything to me. I take everything and break it down into something that can be meaningful. So I had to look, okay, a typical US household would use about 10,000 kilowatt hours of electricity per year. Well, that's 10 megawatt hours in 1 year, right? But this is a terawatt hour. So 1 terawatt hour is equal to 1 million megawatt hours. And what that all means is that if we add up all the energy here, and it's 150,000 terawatt hours per year, that's equivalent to the amount of energy that 15 billion US households, average US households would consume. And you're going to say, there are not 15 billion households in the world. Well, that's fine, because it's not just houses that use energy, right? We've got our cars, and industry uses a huge amount of energy to make all of those consumables that we consume, right? So it's just an idea of just how much energy is consumed worldwide. And it is predicted that that will increase by 25% by the year 2044, by the year 2040. Well, nuclear is a very small part of this portfolio. And a lot of people will discuss nuclear as a way forward. And I am in the camp that says nuclear energy should in fact be a part of our overall energy portfolio. But if we just want to replace current demand, that 150,000 terawatt hours per year, that would require building one new nuclear power plant every day for 40 years. You can look that statistic up. I don't believe statistics when I look them up, so I calculated it myself. I get the same number. You have to build one a year for 40 years. And then guess what? The average lifespan of a nuclear power plant is 40 years, so you never get to quit. You're going to start building nuclear power. The first one you built, you got to tear it down and rebuild it 40 years later. All right, so part of our portfolio, but it can't replace it. This talk is about solar, and so I just want to point out that in a single hour, the sun bathes the earth with the amount of energy that we consume in 1 year. Now, clearly we can't use all of that efficiently, but it just gives you an idea that in 1 hour, the sun gives us the same amount of energy as we consume in 1 year. In other words, 150,000 terawatt hours. To break that down to a place you're more familiar with, the United States, if we want to supply the entire United States energy demands with a solar farm where the solar panels only operate at 10% efficiency, that's all we need. That little square down there in the corner of Arizona, I'm sorry if you live there, that little square right there is the total area that we need, right? So about a quarter of the size of the state of Arizona. Right? And 10% efficiency is possible. We're already doing that with silicon-based solar photovoltaics, even a little better than that. Before I go on, I do just want to kind of point out the connections, since we've been talking about sources of energy. I want to point out the connection between all of the sources that we're talking about here. So we talked a little bit about the sun. The sun, basically, it's what makes plants grow. We've been using plants as fuel for as long as man has been around, right? We eat it, right? And it gives us our own fuel. We burn it. We've been making fires for a long time to warm us up. And then other organisms can eat it, right? So we've got a picture here of an organism eating that. Those organisms can die, sit in a pool for a while, and then we can use that as fossil fuels way out in the future. And so before I go on, just want to bring up this little point here. So if oil is made from decomposed dinosaurs and plastic is made of oil, and it is, then are plastic dinosaurs made from real dinosaurs? Right? So just a little something for you to ponder. But getting back to the point of the energy again. So certainly solar energy is really all energy that we're talking about is in fact solar energy. But then I want to bring it back to solar energy is really nuclear energy, right? The sun is just a nuclear power plant where we have hydrogen fusion and then hydrogen deuterium fusion to eventually make helium. And this kind of nuclear fusion is accompanied by a slight mass loss. And that very slight mass loss is converted into energy. And that's where the huge amount of energy from stars, including our sun, comes from. And so in some ways, there really is no difference between all of this energy. Its source was a nuclear power plant. And so I would ask, is there a difference? In a philosophical way, not with respect to what we've got here, but in a very practical way, absolutely, right? How we deal with each one of these energy sources on Earth matters, right? Building nuclear power plants, where they go, how often we have to build them, right? Those sorts of things matter. How we use fossil fuels and whether or not we're going to run out of them, that all matters. So there really is a difference. And I really want to focus now on, right, how can we more effectively use sunlight? And it starts with a little bit of an understanding of photosynthesis, right? Life on Earth, as I've already mentioned, it depends on the sun. Plants and cyanobacteria, they use the sun's light to drive a thermodynamically disfavored reaction. They take carbon dioxide and water. These are really low energy species. And sunlight turns them into carbohydrate, a really high energy species. Again, something we can burn or something that you and I can eat. And they also make oxygen, which you and I can breathe. So they take these low energy species and shove them uphill, up a thermodynamic hill to make carbohydrate, something that is very useful to us. Right? They make sugars, they make flavors, right? So they even make things that are, plants make things that are very pleasant for us to eat. And so the key there is low energy materials becoming stored chemical energy. But the problem is that CO2, carbon dioxide and water, they don't absorb the visible light that's needed to drive this reaction. So plants have to be clever, right? Plants have chlorophyll, and chlorophyll does absorb light quite nicely. You've seen this in plants. It's what makes plants green. So they absorb the energy from the sunlight, and they funnel that into the complex molecular machinery that eventually converts really simple molecules into high energy complex molecules. And that's what we want to do, right? That's what chemists want to do. It's one of the holy grails of chemistry is artificial photosynthesis. An even simpler form of artificial photosynthesis is to take another really abundant low energy material, which is water, and shove that uphill to make things like hydrogen and oxygen. And you may say, why? Well, that's because the reverse reaction, taking hydrogen and oxygen and making water, is really energetic. So hydrogen would make an excellent fuel. It already does. Every time the space shuttle blasted off, this red tank in the middle was filled with liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. It was funneling those to these engines right here, not the solid rocket boosters, but to this engine right here. And so the giant flames that were coming out of there that could shove the space shuttle out of Earth's gravity were coming from the reaction of hydrogen plus oxygen. Plus, if you burn hydrogen and oxygen, all you make is water. And we can deal with water really well on this planet. The bad news is, once again, water doesn't absorb sunlight, so we can't just do this reaction by putting water in the sun. So I love this quote. This comes from an Italian photochemist in 1912, Giacomo Chimichian. And he wrote, and people, I wish I could write like people did 100 years ago. They wrote beautifully, right? So just listen to what he writes. On the arid lands, there will spring up industrial colonies without smoke and without smokestacks. Forests of glass tubes will extend over the plains, and glass buildings will rise everywhere. Inside of these will take place the photochemical processes that hitherto have been the guarded secret of the plants, but that will have been mastered by human industry. He sees the future, right? He sees the future of solar energy being the way that we go, being the way that we sort of, both industry goes and the way our electricity goes, right? This is what he envisions, right? Giant areas of solar panels that are collecting carbon dioxide and then using electricity and CO2 and water and converting those to things like alcohols that you can burn, and then feeding those to trucks and to boats that come up to port and to the local industry, and then just continuing to harness that CO2 and convert to alcohol, right? That's what he saw, right? He called it the guarded secret of the plants, right? It's not so guarded anymore. We know what plants are doing, but have been mastered by human industry? Not yet. And I bet you that Giacomo Chimichian in 1912 thought that within 100 years, we'd be further along than we are. It's not that we haven't tried. It's that this is really difficult chemistry, right? And so those of you that are students out there, we need you to help us solve these, right? Lots of chemical problems out there to help us solve. We're getting there. This is a little catalyst cell here in a little thing of water. Maybe you can't see it. There's little bubbles coming up from here. And so this catalyst cell is just being hit by sunlight, and hydrogen and oxygen are bubbling off of that, right? So we can do it on a small scale. We really need to be able to scale this up and do it safely on large scales. How are we going to do that? It requires a little bit of knowledge about how light works. What is light? And how are we going to take light and turn it into electricity or into energy? So light is a wave. It's a form of energy produced primarily by stars, and it's propagated to us from the stars as a wave. So here's something like a wave. Think of beach waves a little bit, right? Beach waves, there's a distance between the crests and distance between the troughs, and that is known as the wavelength lambda. And sometimes those waves come slowly. Sometimes those waves have a shorter distance in between them, and that would be a shorter wavelength. And light is a wave, but one that is propagated through space. And the energy of light is inversely proportional to wavelength. So short wavelength means really high energy. Long wavelength means low energy. So here I've got the entire electromagnetic spectrum for you. And it ranges in wavelengths from 10 to the 4th meters. So really long wavelengths. Remember, long wavelengths, low energy. So we don't really mind really low energy stuff bombarding us. That's radio waves. Radio waves are bombarding us all the time. The other end of the spectrum is wavelengths about 10 to the minus 14, a very tiny fraction of a meter. Those are gamma rays. We don't like to be hit with gamma rays, right? That's pretty dangerous to us. X-rays, that's pretty dangerous to us. We even don't like a lot of UV exposure because that can give us skin cancer, right? So these shorter wavelengths, much higher energy, they can do damage to us, right? And then right in the middle of all of this is the visible spectrum. In the visible spectrum, it ranges from 700 nanometers to about 400 nanometers. Longer wavelengths mean lower energy. So red light is the lowest energy light we can see. And purple light is the highest energy light we can see, right? There's all this other light out there, if you want to call it that, right? There's all these other waves out there that we can't see with our eyes, IR and UV, we can't see them. We can only see the visible region here. So just lower energy than visible is the IR region, infrared. And just higher in energy than purple light is the UV region, right? So we'll summarize this on the next slide with a little bit of a cartoon now that you know a bit about energy and colors of light. So the guy goes into a store and says, do you sell ultraviolet bulb? Excuse me? Oh, what about regular violet bulb? No. Blue bulb? No. Green bulb? Yellow bulb? Orange bulb? No, no, no. Rats, I'll take a red bulb. So he buys it, tells his friend, I was hoping for something a little higher energy. And his friend says, well, at least it isn't infrared bulb. All right. So back to the topic at hand. So now, knowing a little bit about light, and that we have all these different colors of light, what causes things to be colored? So first of all, white light is the presence of all of those colors of the rainbow that we just talked about. So in the room that you're probably sitting in, if you looked at the lights, you'd probably say, yeah, those are white lights. Sun, mostly white light. So all of the colors of the rainbow. And so if you have a white surface and that light comes in, it reflects every color of the rainbow. So your eye sees it all and sees white. But if instead I have a green surface, what is going on there is that red and orange and yellow light are being absorbed by the green surface. So are blue and purple, and only the green light is actually being reflected off of it. So you only see the colors that are reflected. You don't see anything that is absorbed. So the question is then, why are leaves green? The simple answer is leaves are green because they absorb all colors of light except for green. Right, so we only see the green. But the really interesting part is all the other colors that are being absorbed. What are they doing? Why is light absorbed? And what happens in the plant or in anything when light is absorbed? So this next slide is probably the most chemistry-ish slide that I have to show you. And I need to start with an understanding of kind of what an atom looks like, or even a molecule, but I'll start with an atom. An atom has a nucleus that is made up of positively charged things called protons and neutral things called neutrons, and that's called the nucleus. And then to balance out those positive charges, we have electrons, and the electrons are way far away from the nucleus, and they kind of orbit the nucleus, right? Not completely unlike the way that planets orbit the sun. Except that with electrons, this orbit is allowed, and maybe this orbit is allowed, but nothing in between is allowed. And so if light comes in, if the light comes in and it's got just the right energy, if it's got the same energy as the difference between an electron here and here, it can shove that electron from this orbital to this orbit. It'd be a little like a giant energy beam hitting planet Earth and shoving it from its orbit up to the orbit of Saturn, right? And you'd have to put in a lot of energy to do that, right? So light is just enough energy to take an electron from a low energy orbit up to one of these higher energy orbits. And so that will then, that photon will be absorbed. And so the color of light that's absorbed depends on the energy gaps between the electrons, or where the electrons live, between the orbits. And so some things absorb green light, some things absorb red light, some things absorb purple light, some things absorb all of those things based on where the electrons are. So when the energy of the photon exactly matches one of these gaps, the light, that's a photon, is light, that can be absorbed. It will result in a promotion of electron to a higher energy orbital. And what I want you to recognize is what this means is that every time light hits you and is absorbed, and if you are wearing something that is colorful, then you've got a lot of light that's being absorbed. And every time light is absorbed, an electron jumps from a lower energy to a higher energy. Usually all it does is jumps back. It goes up and back and up and back. And here's what I want you to understand. If you're sitting in a well-lit room right now and you're wearing a colored shirt, then on the order of a billion electrons are doing this every second. Every second that passes, a billion times a billion, at least a billion times a billion electrons are going boop, 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 right? Our job as a chemist is to try to figure out after they're promoted, instead of just letting them drop back down, let's do some work with those electrons. It's sure sounding a lot like electricity to me for me to be shoving an electron to higher energy. And that's what solar photovoltaics do. You have a panel that absorbs sunlight. And when it does that, it somehow sends electrons through an external circuit, and we do work with that. And here's how that works. We do it with a semiconductor, something called a semiconductor. And so in a semiconductor, electrons have homes. And then there's a bunch of empty electron homes in a semiconductor. Their homes are called the valence band. The empty electron homes are called a conduction band. And turns out that there is a cost differential between these homes and these homes, an energy cost differential. And so the electrons live here, but if somebody feeds them a little bit of money in the form of light, they can afford to go to a higher energy home. And so they go up. Normally what they want to do is just jump back down. But if we engineer it properly, we can send that electron through an external circuit before it gets back to its home. We can harness that, we can do work. Great, we made electricity. So here are two substances. The one on the left is pretty deeply colored, it's silicon. The one on the right is titanium dioxide, it's white. These are both semiconductors. Silicon has a home for its electrons, and it has empty homes for electrons, and there's only a small cost between where they live and where they don't live. Titanium dioxide, there is a large energy cost between where they live and where the empty homes are. And so light, all visible wavelengths of light are high enough energy to promote electrons from these lower energy homes to these higher energy homes. That means silicon will absorb all energy of light, all wavelengths of light. And if something absorbs all white light, it is pretty much black. And that's why silicon is black. It's also shiny, but it's pretty much black. Titanium dioxide, visible light, is not high enough energy to promote an electron from one of the homes where they live to one of the empty homes. It's too big of an energy gap. They can only absorb in the ultraviolet region. And so since this absorbs no visible light at all, it's white because all light reflects off of it. And because of that, here's what we do mostly with titanium dioxide. We paint buildings with it. That should also indicate to you that titanium dioxide is pretty cheap. With silicon, we actually make solar panels out of it. And it's because there's a lot of light in the visible region. So here's a spectrum of the sun. Most of the sunlight is around 500 nanometers. Only a little bit of it is in the UV region. And then there's a lot of infrared out here also. And so if we use titanium dioxide as a solar cell, we can only harness a small fraction of the sunlight, right? That's why we use silicon, because it can harness all of this. Right? Well, the advantage of titanium dioxide is it's a lot cheaper and more processable than silicon. Solar grade silicon is relatively expensive. It's cheap enough that if you live in California, it makes economic sense to put in solar panels. But if you don't pay much for electricity like us in South Carolina, then the economic reasons are not as compelling to do it in South Carolina. There are environmental reasons to do it, but there really aren't economic reasons. And if you want to break through, you've got to make it economically reasonable for people to do. Right? So titanium dioxide, I said, couldn't be used, but it can now. So titanium dioxide doesn't absorb light. So some people figured out that if we take two glass slides, so that's what these are right here. These are two glass slides. If we take two glass slides, but it's special glass, it's conductive glass. So it conducts electricity, but it's transparent. And then if we paint this one with little titanium dioxide microspheres, and that's what these little white circles are. Those are titanium dioxide microspheres. Well, if sun hits that, it's not going to absorb any light. But then let's put a molecule on here that does absorb light. And remember what I told you? When a molecule absorbs light, it makes electrons move around. This molecule, when it absorbs light, an electron moves from this part of the molecule out to this part of the molecule. That electron has enough energy now to do some work. It jumps into the semiconductor, can run through an external circuit, come over here, so we can do work. The problem is this now lost an electron and can't do it again. So that electron's going to jump onto a little shuttle. The shuttle's going to swim it over here, and we've completed the circuit. We can do it all over again. So let me show you that one more time, but animated. Here's a piece of glass. Here's a piece of glass, but they're actually conductive. We have a thin titanium dioxide layer, and that's been coated with a little bit of a dye that's deeply colored. We have a thin layer of water with a shuttle in it. That's something that's going to swim the electron back over there. I do want to point out that though I've drawn this as quite thick, it's quite thin. The whole thickness is basically the thickness of 2 layers of glass, because these layers are super thin. And so this is only as thick as 2 panes of glass. So when light comes in, remember it moves electrons? Light moves electrons. The electron goes to higher energy. Now it's in high enough energy where it can get injected into our semiconductor. We can send it through an external circuit. It can do work, jumps onto the shuttle. The shuttle then carries it back to where it started from, so it can do it all over again and make another cycle. And we can make electricity that way. So that's how they work. Here's some pictures of dye-sensitized solar cells. They can be beautiful, right? They can be made with different colored dyes in them that have just the right properties. And then they can be put in buildings. And so this is the Swiss Tech Convention Center in Switzerland. And these are panels in a dye-sensitized solar cells. These are windows that are making electricity, stained glass windows that are making electricity. Here is a close-up of those panels. There are a few different colors here. Here are some other examples of installations of dye-sensitized solar cells. To make ones that aren't very efficient, they're actually pretty easy to make. You can even make them with this is raspberry juice. You can make them with raspberry juice. So we have some people from high school students come to our lab each summer and make dye-sensitized solar cells. They're not very pretty dye-sensitized solar cells, and they're not very efficient, but they make electricity. And this one's showing about 0.4 of a volt. So we have a lot of fun doing that each summer. And the question right now for many chemists is, the dye that is being used has this metal in the middle that's called ruthenium. And many of you probably haven't heard of ruthenium, and that's because it's pretty rare and it's expensive. We would run out of that pretty fast. And so a lot of people are trying to figure out this molecule that makes a great dye that moves the electrons around in just the right way, right? When this absorbs light, an electron moves from this ruthenium out to this part of the molecule. So now I have an electron here that can get injected into the TiO2. And we want to make molecules that don't have ruthenium in them. And so our group has been working on making molecules with iron and titanium. And when these absorb light, it shoves an electron. An electron moves from the iron over to the titanium. Does kind of that electron movement that we want it to do. And so if we can get the titanium part stuck to the titanium dioxide, maybe the electron can go from here to here, go through an external circuit. So here's a picture of that, right? We want to replace this with the molecules that our group has been working on. And so the idea would be is that when light comes in, it shoves an electron from this part of the molecule to this part. Now it's close to, we've tied it off to titanium dioxide, and now hopefully that electron can move over. These molecules that we've been making are really deeply colored. That's exactly what you want. You want something that a tiny bit of it will absorb a lot of light. And so these molecules are very, very absorbent. And we can make them in different colors. My students have made many varieties of these. We can make green ones and blue ones and red ones. They all look, don't these molecules look really similar to one another? All we're doing is tweaking what happens out here on this part of the molecule. So here we have little extra, very simple things here. Here we have nothing on this part of the molecule. Here we have a little bit more complex thing over here. And each one of these molecules absorbs different wavelengths of light. This one absorbs at 650 nanometers. This one absorbs at 580 nanometers. This one absorbs at 540 nanometers. So they're different colors and they can absorb different parts of the solar spectrum. And use that potentially, possibly to make electricity by beginning this. So our group is working on trying to figure out now how to get these connected to titanium dioxide. We've got a student working very hard in the lab right now, well, maybe not right now, but during the days to try to make that happen. So I really want to acknowledge those students who have done this work, at least the ones for the last 4 years who have been involved in this. Fantastic set of students without whom none of this work would have happened. They're really the people that get in there, roll up their sleeves and do this. Been very fortunate to be funded from the National Science Foundation, recently also in part through the Made in South Carolina grant, also funded by Furman University. I also just have to acknowledge the great teachers and mentors who have inspired me through the years, right from my high school teacher, through my college mentor, my graduate school mentors, and then I've been on sabbatical a couple of times and done research at a number of places, and the people at those institutions have mentored me as well. And I also want to thank you for the time you've taken to listen to this, and I would be glad to find out if you have any questions here. So Renee, do you want me to stop sharing here, or?
That's up to you. I mean, someone might have a question where you want to refer back to a slide. So if you want, you can keep it up. But
Okay.
yeah, feel free to use the chat box if you're more comfortable with that, or you can just unmute yourself and ask your question.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
So if I remember correctly, a current standard photovoltaic cell has a lifespan of about 10 years before it would need to be replaced. How long would a lifespan of a titanium dioxide solar cell last?
Yeah, so so right now less than that, right? Otherwise you'd be seeing these a lot more than the Swiss Tech Convention Center and some other places. They've got a little bit of liquid in them, and it's a little bit harder than you might imagine to get perfect seals on these things. And so occasionally under an installation, you might see a little bit of stuff dripping out. And we certainly, the ruthenium molecules that are in there certainly could cycle for 20 or 30 years. But right now, they certainly do not have the robustness of a silicon solar photovoltaic. We will try to get there, but it's a great question. They're not that robust at this point. And again, they're not going to replace silicon, but you can immediately start imagining installations for these, right? Places where you want some windows, you want those windows to be colorful. Why not make electricity at the same time as having an art installation? So part of the overall solar portfolio, but great question.
Hi, Paul.
Hi, Raj.
Yeah, very nice talk. Thoroughly enjoyed it. One quick question is, going back to the plants, for example, why is it that the green color plants are the most efficient at this conversion of simple molecules to complex molecules? Just like you said, I mean, if the leaf is green, that means it is absorbing all other colors except for green.
Except for green. Yeah.
So what is so special about that green wavelength?
Well, it's really, the question actually is what's special about the blue wavelength and the red wavelength?
Exactly, right.
Those are the ones that are being absorbed, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And each one of those is going to have each one of those is going to be promoting an electron, right, in one of these catalysts. I was a little afraid that somebody was going to ask me one of these biochemistry questions, and I haven't spent a lot of time studying photosynthesis recently to know exactly, which part of the step is using, say, a blue photon. But certainly the blue photons are the highest energy ones.
Right.
So you can sort of do the most work with those. The red are the lowest energy ones, so you're not going to be doing quite as much. But I suspect that both of those are very important in the overall process, or they wouldn't have been designed that way.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. And as I was preparing this again, I thought I really need to spend some more time, studying the biomechanisms of photosynthesis. And you certainly have inspired me to probably go back and study that again.
So relating that back to these dye-sensitized solar cells, would you expect if you were to sort of, like you have these different dyes which are different colors, would you expect the efficiency to sort of depend if you were to somehow combine all these dyes or selectively use combination of dyes, more than one dye, for example?
Yeah, so it's a great question. The most efficient solar cells, for example, are sandwiches of many different semiconductors that each one absorbs a different wavelength of the light. So the light that doesn't get absorbed by the top one funnels through to the next one. And the light that doesn't get absorbed there funnels through to the next one, right? And so you build this layered semiconductor, and we can get up to nearly 50%, but they're 50% efficiency with those. They're really expensive though, so we use solar concentrators, so we only have to use a very small solar panel like that.
Yeah.
Doing that with these, Raj, would sort of defeat one of the purposes of these, which would be to use them in installations where you don't want an ugly solar panel. If you stacked these in that way, you're just going to get black, right? No light will get through. And then you wouldn't use it in more of an artistic installation.
Got it. Yeah.
So, but yeah, no, but that is a fantastic way of doing the more totally semiconductor-based solar cells. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yep, thank you.